If you've added broccoli sprouts to your diet, hoping to get maximum benefits, but you're just swallowing them like a regular salad, you may not be using their full potential. Broccoli sprouts are often mentioned in preventive medicine research because of a compound called sulforaphane, but it only forms under specific conditions. Today, I'm Dr. Helena, a physician and PhD, and I'll explain this process in simple terms. We will talk about why 3 to 5 day old sprouts differ in composition from mature broccoli, how sulforaphane is formed, how it is connected to cellular defense mechanisms, including systems involved in DNA protection, and what current research shows about its possible links to metabolism, inflammation, and certain neurological conditions. And most importantly, I will show you one simple action that helps activate sulforaphane formation from sprouts. I will also share one practical tip: how using a common spice can increase its formation when consuming broccoli. Let's break down how this mechanism actually works. Why sprouts specifically? Why aren't we talking about mature broccoli? After all, mature broccoli is also considered a healthy vegetable. The reason is that at early stages of growth, the plant contains especially high concentrations of protective compounds. A young sprout holds a kind of reserve of substances that help the plant defend itself in the first days of life. One of these compounds is glucoraphanin, the precursor of sulforaphane. Studies show that 3 to 5 day old broccoli sprouts can contain dozens of times more of it than mature vegetables. That is why even a small amount of sprouts can provide a relatively high intake of these plant compounds. But here we come to the key point. In the sprout itself, sulforaphane does not exist. Inside plant cells, there are two separate components, glucoraphanin and the enzyme myrosinase. As long as the cell remains intact, they are stored in different compartments and barely interact. When the plant tissue is damaged, for example during chewing, cutting, or blending, the cells break apart and these components mix. At that moment, a chemical reaction begins, resulting in the formation of sulforaphane. This is part of the plant's defense system against insects. When a caterpillar starts chewing a leaf, the cells break, the components mix, and a chemical reaction occurs, releasing pungent sulforaphane to deter the pest. Your task is to become that caterpillar. That is why the way you consume sprouts truly matters. For this reaction to occur, it is important to chew them thoroughly or chop them well, for example in a salad or in a blender. There is another nuance. The enzyme myrosinase is sensitive to high temperatures. With strong heating, its activity decreases, which is why the highest formation of sulforaphane occurs when sprouts are eaten raw or minimally processed. That is why many experts recommend adding broccoli sprouts to dishes in their fresh form, for example to salads or to warm meals after cooking. Epigenetics: how food interacts with your genes. Now let's look at what happens in the body when sulforaphane enters the bloodstream. This is not a vitamin in the traditional sense, but a biologically active compound that can influence cellular defense mechanisms. One of the key mechanisms is considered to be activation of the NRF2 signaling pathway. This protein regulates the expression of a large number of genes associated with antioxidant defense and cellular detoxification enzymes. When sulforaphane enters a cell, it can activate NRF2-dependent processes. As a result, the body increases production of its own antioxidant systems, including synthesis of molecules such as glutathione, which play a role in protecting cells from oxidative stress. Experimental studies have also shown that sulforaphane can influence the activity of certain enzymes involved in epigenetic regulation, mechanisms that can alter gene activity without changing the DNA sequence itself. These effects are actively being studied in the context of inflammation, cellular aging, and cancer-related processes. However, it is important to understand that most of these findings come from laboratory or early clinical studies, so their role in prevention or treatment is still under investigation. Clinical data: autism, diabetes, and detox. Let's look at findings that are currently being actively discussed in the scientific literature. Neuroinflammation and autism spectrum disorders, ASD. Several clinical studies conducted by researchers from Harvard and Johns Hopkins University examined the effects of sulforaphane in young people with ASD. Some of these studies reported improvements in certain behavioral measures, including social interaction and reduced irritability. It is suggested that this may be related to reduced oxidative stress and effects on cellular energy metabolism. However, it is important to note that these studies are still experimental and require further confirmation. In a number of recent clinical studies, broccoli sprout extract has been investigated for its effects on glucose metabolism. Some show a moderate reduction in fasting glucose levels in patients with type 2 diabetes. One proposed mechanism is reduced glucose production in the liver, gluconeogenesis. Nevertheless, such supplements are considered only a potential adjunct to therapy, not a replacement for standard treatment. If you live in a large city, this information is for you. Sulforaphane can activate enzymes involved in neutralizing and eliminating various xenobiotics, substances that enter the body from the environment. In a randomized clinical trial conducted in China and published in the journal Cancer Prevention Research, participants consumed a broccoli sprout beverage daily for 12 weeks. They showed increased excretion of certain air pollutants, specifically benzene by about 61% and acrolein by about 23%. Researchers associate this effect with activation of detoxification enzymes regulated by the NRF2 pathway. Laboratory studies suggest that sulforaphane may exhibit antibacterial activity against Helicobacter pylori. However, these findings are considered supportive and do not replace standard therapy for gastritis or peptic ulcer disease. Who should be cautious? Patients often ask during consultations, "Doctor, can broccoli sprouts negatively affect the thyroid?" This is a common and valid question. Cruciferous vegetables contain compounds known as goitrogens. These substances can form thiocyanates, which in theory may compete with iodine uptake by the thyroid and, at very high intake levels, potentially affect the synthesis of T3 and T4 hormones. However, in practice, the situation is more nuanced. Current evidence suggests that a significant goitrogenic effect usually occurs in the setting of iodine deficiency. If a person has adequate iodine intake, moderate consumption of cruciferous vegetables, including broccoli sprouts, generally does not have a noticeable impact on thyroid function. It is also important to note that the main compound in broccoli sprouts is glucoraphanin, a precursor to sulforaphane. It is not classified as a typical goitrogen, and in normal amounts, is not considered a risk factor for a healthy thyroid. Most studies examine moderate intakes, for example around 30–50 grams of sprouts per day, which do not show significant effects on hormonal balance in individuals without iodine deficiency. However, if someone already has diagnosed thyroid conditions, such as hypothyroidism or autoimmune thyroiditis, it is reasonable to discuss dietary choices with a healthcare provider. In such cases, an individualized approach is usually recommended. A practical takeaway is simple. Ensure adequate iodine intake in your diet, for example from sea fish, seafood, and iodized salt. With normal iodine levels, moderate consumption of cruciferous vegetables typically does not cause thyroid-related issues. Practical tip: how to increase sulforaphane formation. One important factor is the presence of the enzyme myrosinase, which triggers the conversion of glucoraphanin into sulforaphane. Freezing or cooking can partially reduce the activity of this enzyme. There is a simple trick. You can add a small amount of foods that contain active myrosinase to broccoli or its sprouts. For example, a pinch of ground mustard seeds, a small amount of wasabi powder. These plants also contain enzymes that help activate sulforaphane formation. Some studies show that adding a small amount of mustard powder can significantly increase its production. Now, a few words about the sprouts themselves. You can buy them in a supermarket, but it is important to pay attention to freshness. The sprouts should be clean, without slime or signs of mold. Typically, the highest concentration of beneficial compounds is found in young sprouts around day 3 to 5 of growth. Another simple option is to grow them yourself. All you need are quality seeds, water, and a few days of time. This approach allows you to always have a fresh product on hand. It is important to remember, health rarely depends on a single superfood. Much more important are consistent daily habits in nutrition and lifestyle. By adding a small amount of broccoli sprouts to your diet, you simply increase the variety of beneficial plant foods that support the body's natural defense mechanisms. And finally, a simple rule: chew the sprouts thoroughly. Try not to expose them to high heat, and if you wish, add a pinch of mustard. These small details can help you get the maximum benefit from this product. See you in the next video.